So the next talk will be about imagining the future of computing in a world within limits. And so the talk is given by Daniel Pargman, which is and he is an associate professor in media technology with a specialization in sustainability at the Department of Media Technology and Interaction Design at the KTH in Stockholm, Sweden. And maybe a last thing to underline is that your research interests are situated in the intersection of computing and sustainability, and in understanding the role of ICT in decreasing CO2 emissions and in speeding up the necessary shift to a more sustainable society. And then I guess the floor is yours and for the whole talk.
This or this?
You can take whatever you want.
As long as it works. So,
as long as
yeah, it works. Yes, so I'm going to talk about computing within limits, and I actually brought my own computer because I have some notes that I might want to check that are not on the PDF, so I will sort of juggle. Well, here's the remote. Okay, so it's called computing within limits. It could have been called, let's see if this works. Yes, computing within limits, and oh, and now of course this doesn't change, so I have to, yeah, okay. And carbon law computing, I'm going to get around to what the carbon law is, but I'm not going to actually start with that. So you will have to live with this insecurity or uncertainty at the moment. But I guess that we will disseminate the slides afterwards. There's a reference to carbon law and exponential roadmap that you will then have access to. Okay. Yes, and as Thibault said, I'm at the KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. This is the view from the bell tower of the courtyard. The university is, of course, much larger, but this is a nice picture because the fourth window from the left over this small house is where I sit, over there. Okay, I don't have a pointer, but I do have a pointer. Oh, there. Yeah, okay. And as so I'm this is part of the School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, but my department is the most wishy-washy soft part of that. So it's human-computer interaction and the intersection of people using systems and the computer systems. So that's my my home, disciplinary home, but I have a mixed background of also social science. And I lead a research group together with my colleague Elina. We just relaunched our blog. We changed our name this past spring, so now we will also have a blog if you want to check us out or perhaps even follow. So now we're called the Sustainable Futures Lab. And this is what we do in one slide. Primarily number one, then the role of ICT in the transition to a more sustainable society. And we have projects on food, energy, transportation, cities. We also do futuring and future studies. And then we've been teaching sustainability and ICT for about 10 years. And we've also kind of studied and reflected on our own teaching. So we also do some work there. And we are then exploring stuff which is new to most people, perhaps not to many of you here, but the intersection of ICT and sustainability. I'm going to get back to limits at the top later in the talk. I also put the SICT summer school over there. This looks really shitty, the resolution, but this was a summer school we did last summer, ICT for sustainability, and it was the week before the SICT summer school. And during the spring, this SICT summer school turned up, and we didn't know who those people were. But they seemed to have put a summer school just the week after ours, and that was made us nervous. Like, will people go here or there? Will they split, or will they go to both, perhaps, because they were in Belgium and Netherlands? It seemed to work out, and we definitely didn't have the energy to do another summer school the next year. So it's really great that you do this, by the way. And it's really great that it's sort of like a bottom-up movement of PhD students and postdocs, a lot of people organizing. So thank you for doing this work. And I think that you also have a more hard-hitting theme than would possibly be possible for like tenured people who need to be pretend to be grown-ups and responsible and those things. So you can, you have some alibi because you're younger, you can be a bit more wild and crazy. And I want to point out this. So this was the ICT for Sustainability community that did the summer school. It was supposed to be 1 year earlier, but we postponed it because of COVID. We had no idea it would drag on for so long. So we still had to do it online 1 year later. But this summer in June, we had, well, I say we, I don't know, we had. I haven't really organized one of the conferences, but I've been to all of them. So there was a conference just before June, and next year it will be in Brittany in France. So that could be of interest to you in June. You just check out ICT4S and you'll find it. I don't think there's a website yet, but. And very possibly the year after it will be in Stockholm. How about that? And now I'm going to brag a little, not just for the sake of bragging, but we presented a paper at the conference which won the Best Paper Award. And I want you to check out the title, because this is something that we've become interested in lately as part of our teaching and reflecting on our teaching. We've been a bit concerned that when we teach sustainability, we don't really shy away from harsh truths. And some of the students got perhaps not clinically depressed, but they got sad, at least during parts of the course. And we've been wondering for a couple of years what our responsibility is as teachers and like what we should do about this. And we have now come around to the fact that perhaps we need to care more or think about the emotional reaction of learning things which you didn't know before and how that affects students. So we wrote this paper called Addressing Students' Eco-Anxiety When Teaching Sustainability in Computing Education. It actually is wrong. We changed the title in the last second, so it's When Teaching Sustainability in Higher Education now, but it's online, probably available if you have a university account and your university pays its fees. So this is something very different than what I expect most people will talk about, but it could be of interest. We're really happy, and we're going to continue to both work with this and probably also write about it. Yeah, and then we have a lot of research projects. This should be updated. I'm in 4 of them, but actually there are 2 new projects that I work in that are not on this page and blah, blah. But anyway, we have a nice group with a critical mass of people. And we also we like to have guests. We have a guest right now, Professor Adrian Friday from Lancaster University. I know you're from Lancaster University. He's your supervisor, I know, and he told me to say hello to you. And probably you should go to his talk next week. This is on Tuesday on Zoom. So you have no excuse. And I will post the link in Slack. So if you're interested, will ICT help save the world? Exploring the role of ICT in promoting sustainability. So he's visiting us for a month. And when he leaves, we have an empty desk. How about that? Okay, but this is what I'm going to talk about. And no, not that computer. I'm probably going to do this several times. This interactive session might shrink a bit. Could you remind me, when do you want me to be finished, more or less? Yeah, so 40, yeah. I might shrink number 2 to have some time for number 4. And it will, probably the pace will be pretty fast now also because I talk fast and I have lots of slides. But first I'm going to tell you, so the purpose of the talk, I'm not sure I will manage, but I hope to challenge you and perhaps even provoke some of you. That would be nice. And also to make at least some impression on everyone, perhaps a big impression on some, I don't know. And also invite you to computing within limits, to that community and that conference/workshop. So I'm actually going to talk some about that community also as part of the talk. But I will start with economy. This is a model which, this picture comes from Wikipedia. I haven't been very conscientious about writing where my pictures come from always, so sorry about that. But this is an image or a picture of the economy, and there's this circular movement, not circular economy, but so we work and get wages and we use them to buy stuff which are produced in the workplaces where we work. And it all just goes round and round, and everybody lived happily forever, possibly, or when this was made, at least in the 50s, I think, this model of, it's called the circular flow of income. And you can make more advanced models where you add a couple of things, like here, government takes taxes, but they spend the money, so that also circulates. Yeah, and you can shrink it and put it in a box. And this is probably what most traditional economists would mean by the economy. So let's call it the economy. Oops. However, so this would be able to go on forever, I guess, because it just circulates stuff. But what is not in that picture, and what traditional economists don't really think a lot about, is that this image of the economy needs things to go in and needs things to go out. So we add inputs and outputs. This is a picture that Herman Daly, who is one of the fathers of ecological economics, those are the good economists who actually think about resources and energy also, and have been worried about that for quite some time. He wanted to include this in a report at the World Bank. So he wanted this image instead of that image. For half a year or so, it went back and forth, and they were negotiating. He was head of sustainability, you know, but in the end, they couldn't really, they refused to put this image in the report, and he quit his job. So what's the problem with this image? Well, this here implies that the economy needs stuff to work, and it produces outputs, and the outputs are not the goods that we buy. It's rather sort of waste and pollution that is an output of the industrial production system. And this implied that the economy perhaps couldn't grow forever, for example, and so they refused to have it back then. This was almost 30 years ago. This picture sort of implies that the economy is housed on a finite planet, and if it needs resources and it produces pollution, like, for example, e-waste, we saw a picture from Tina's talk, or carbon emissions, that there are limits to how much output from the economic system, waste, that the Earth, a living planet, can accommodate, and also limits to inputs in terms of resources, mining and energy, and so on. I'll actually show you a slightly more advanced picture, because this is a good, which I might not use when I give a lecture perhaps, but I really like this picture. This is again Herman Daly, a nice paper that he wrote 30 years ago. Oh, okay, that's just a summary of what I just said. No, here's the picture. So it's a bit complicated, but the interesting thing is that you have the left picture, which you could say is the economy 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And the oceans were teeming with fish, and the problem from our point of view was that we didn't have enough fishing boats. And there were forests all over, and we didn't have sawmills, there were oil, we didn't have refineries or tankers. We actually didn't really know what to use the oil for 100 years ago. We didn't have 1 billion cars either. But so the economy is limited by capital and by stuff that we could build, but we hadn't built them. We didn't have fishing fleets the size of our current fleets, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't have sawmills and so on. But today, the economy has grown, and it's sort of, the bottleneck is not any longer man-made capital and stuff we can produce or buy for money, but rather the problem is that there isn't enough fish in the ocean to accommodate for the number of fishing boats we have any longer. And there are plenty of sawmills, but there aren't enough forests. And There are plenty of refineries and super tankers and cars, but we're running out of oil, or oil is a limited resource anyway. So this here implies that the economy, there are limits to the economy. And what he says here is that all our economic models, they build on this empty world. They are empty world economics models that were formulated 100 or 200 years ago by economists who lived in a world where there was just plenty of everything. But we're not living there any longer, and our economic models don't really work. And I guess that you could say that full world economics would be ecological economics, that again, Herman Daly was one of the pioneers of exploring. And there's certainly, if we live in a world of limitations, there are certainly not any limit on the challenges that we are facing. Oh my God, yeah, I'm getting so confused because I have the wrong picture all the time, but now I'm talking about stuff that will be the next picture. But anyway, so if we have modern society in the middle and we need resources to make it work and we produce pollution and waste, I'm going to concentrate not on carbon emissions primarily, but rather on inputs, energy and minerals, actually mostly energy now. And there certainly is no end to a list of challenges that we are facing. This is not an exhaustive list. It just happened to be a slide that I've used for quite a lot of years now. And to take an example of recent developments, we have war now in Europe. As you probably know, this also affects the export of wheat from Ukraine, which is blocked, and they also produce less wheat. And I would assume that also Russia produces less wheat, which runs the risk of leading to starvation and possibly to refugees, climate refugees, or refugees from hunger. So that would mean, you know, the starvation works together with the fact that we're 8 billion people. So if there were 4 billion people, perhaps it wouldn't be a big problem if wheat production went down 5 or 10%. But now it is a problem for people in the poorest countries. You don't need to worry. We will still be able to buy bread next year, but perhaps there will be other people who can't. And this could lead to social instability, both in countries with starving people and in countries where they want to go. But I'm actually going to concentrate now on energy, and especially, or in particular, oil, which I've been interested in for a long time. This was my way into sustainability. And oil is really, really important. It's the #1 energy source, and together with coal and gas makes up for somewhere between 80 to 85% of all the energy we use, which also already there, you can see what the problem is. If we're going to phase out fossil fuels, we need to ramp up everything else by a factor of a lot. And also it happens to be the case that perhaps it's hard to replace oil sometimes. It's very versatile. It's easy to transport, for example, as apart from coal or gas, you need to build pipelines or to freeze it down and have, what's it called, LNGs? Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. So it's the biggest energy resource in the world. More than 1/3 of all energy we use globally is oil, but more than 95% of all transports depend on oil. So if oil gets more expensive, transport will be more expensive, for example, which will have implications for other things, including supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. There's still a lot of oil, but we are basically, of course, picking the low-hanging fruit first. So whatever is left, I mean, what we burn now is gone tomorrow, and over time, it tends to be harder to get at it and more expensive. We have to go for resources which are not of as high quality, for example, like so-called unconventional oil, for example. So we're not really running out of oil yet, but we are running out of good and cheap oil, and we have to then progressively replace it by more expensive oil. So basically, here's a picture that I've stolen from a collaborator who leads the Global Energy Systems Research Group in Uppsala University. So you have individual oil fields in the region, and the production curve typically look like the green things over there. You ramp up production, and then you reach a plateau, and then it decreases slowly. But then you find other, or you start to exploit more oil fields, and together they add up to this bell curve. And the peak of the oil production of this region is at the very top. And this is not just a curve that illustrates peak oil for a region, but also for a country, or for that matter, for the world. And here are real figures that come from the same research group. I don't have, they are 10 years old, but you can imagine what it looks like. But basically, this is Norway, which passed the peak 20 years ago. It's an oil exporting country, but perhaps won't be forever. So, and typically also they found the first and best fields first, like the 4 fields, let's see, over there. And then progressively have to replace them with smaller and smaller. You know, we pick the low-hanging fruit. So it's sort of like the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland, where you have to run faster and faster to stay in the same place. That's what we have to do then to get our energy fix, or our oil fix at least. Okay, and as I said before, oil is very useful. You measure it and you buy it in barrels. And right now the price is $90. I have stopped following the price. It goes up, it goes down. In June, when I showed this picture the last time, it was $120. So the price has decreased by 25%. It's hard sometimes to know exactly why, because it is linked to many other things. But the energy content of an oil barrel is equivalent to working 25,000 hours of hard physical labor, and it just costs $90. So it's very inexpensive, despite the fact that the normal price when globalization took hold 20, 30 years ago was more like $20 per barrel. So this is kind of like the infrastructure that we built up during much of the 20th century sort of wants inexpensive oil, and today the oil is not so inexpensive any longer, and that is creating problems for the global economic system. By the way, these barrels, they looked very rough and I used them, but then I have realized that they are actually from a computer game, and they look like they are real oil barrels. And you can see that also because this, let's see this thing here, it's the same there and there. It's actually the same barrel, just with different colors, but they still look more real than the real ones I found pictures of, which is also interesting. Okay, so I'm personally interested, I've been sort of scared of, so what happens when oil becomes expensive, and perhaps not just $90 expensive, but a lot more, or scarce, or whatever. But I personally think that a lot of things will change, not just by degree, but perhaps sort of the direction. Perhaps there will, well, like Macron said the other day, that we have come to the end of the road in terms of economic growth, and perhaps oil being more scarce and expensive is part of that. So what happens when we need to use less oil every year because of geological limits? That is a topic that is very hard to do research on, because it hasn't happened, and we have a hard time imagining it after like 100, 150 years of using more all the time. So here's the future studies part. This is an article we wrote 5 years ago, which was super fun discussion project together again with let's see, this guy is the Global Energy Systems group. What if there had only been half the oil? Rewriting history to envision the consequences of peak oil. So this is a thought experiment where we said, let's imagine that we know pretty much, or he knows how much oil there is, including oil we haven't really used up yet. There's some uncertainty, of course, but more or less we know. So let's imagine that there had only been half of that oil on Earth because of small shifts in geology 100 million years ago. So stopped the formation of oil, or it seeped to the ground slowly and it just disappeared over the ages. What if we found and exploited oil at the same places and at the same pace that we have done, but then we run into this problem that, there wasn't that much in our alternative world? When would peak oil have happened, and can we imagine what the consequences would be? So peak oil, calculating when it would have happened, he came to the conclusion that it would have happened in the beginning of the 70s, which is so intriguing because that's when the first oil crisis happened. The difference, though, is that the first oil crisis in 73 was a political decision from Arab countries having to do with war with Israel and blah, blah, punishing countries that supported Israel. So it was a political decision, but in our scenario, it was geological fact. And after 1973, oil production globally decreased year by year. So this is, I guess, this was our first dip into using scenarios, and in this case, even counterfactual scenarios of imagining what hasn't happened but could have, to see if we can imagine what would have happened in the 80s and 90s. There would have been no globalization as we saw it in our world. And can we then use that to imagine what could happen in our world when we hit the roof, or when we run, when peak oil happens? But I will actually leave this, and I don't exactly know why I have the next two slides any longer. So I'll probably just skip them. Well, I guess it's just a way to contrast, but it doesn't, yeah, anyway, I'll mention, this is the traditional view of sustainability, or rather perhaps sustainable development, which is, you could say the UN-sponsored version of sustainability is sustainable development. So you have ecological, social, and economic sustainability, and they are equally important. They are the three pillars. What it doesn't really say here is what happens when they come into conflict with each other, and it doesn't really say that anyone is more or less important than the other. So this seems to lead to wishy-washy consequences, that you can always negotiate about what is or isn't sustainable, or what is or isn't sustainable development. This is a more hard-hitting version, which also fits the blue marble picture, the Earth floating in space. So this is a researchers, perhaps you could say that politicians like the previous one better, and researchers perhaps then like this better, as sustainability researchers, because here the social sustainability is bounded by what the planet can bear, or what the limits of ecological sustainability, and the economic system should be bounded and limited by what we want, what purposes we want it to serve in terms of social sustainability, which put limits on how big demands we can have as humans on what kind of society we want, and how big limits, it put limits on the economic system. And it's quite clear that the economic system should serve social sustainability, or should serve society, which is a nicer model. And the previous one, you could say, is also embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, which also makes them riddled with contradictions, because it's hard to fulfill all 15. There have been articles mapping contradictions between different goals, for example, in terms of ecological sustainability and social sustainability. It's hard to all out win on both of these, because they sometimes contradict. There's a consumption goal, for example, and everybody should have clean energy and so on. Everybody should have a lot of things that perhaps the Earth can't deliver. There's a researcher in New Zealand who has another definition of sustainability that I like. And he says that sustainability is ethics expanded over time and space. So if you expand ethics over time, it means that we should take children and grandchildren and so on into account for the decisions we make today. And if we expand ethics in space, we have like North and South, or us and them, or rich and poor, which should then be taken into account also in the decisions we make. Yeah, so now what do we do, or how does computing within limits fit here? Now I'm going to refer to sort of, I guess it's the article that we wrote after having run the conferences for a couple of years. We wrote an article that summarized the thinking that sort of goes into this, called Computing Within Limits. And in that article, we proposed 3 key principles. And this is published for computer scientists, by the way. Communications of the ACM is printed in something like 100,000 copies, and it goes to computer professionals and researchers. So in this doesn't perhaps sound extremely controversial here, but we had to weigh every word on a scale before we put it down in the article. But still, we suggested that we should or that we do in computing within limits, and we should in computing in general, question growth, consider models of scarcity, and strive towards reducing energy and material consumption. And this came out of the Computing Within Limits conference/workshop. It's labeled as a workshop, perhaps it is. And from the first and second call for papers, it says, a goal of this community is to impact society through the design and development of computing systems in the abundant present for use in a future of limits and/or scarcity. So this is what we saw. We only think of some futures, or possibly even one future of abundance and growth, but perhaps we then should think of, we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket. It also invites, this workshop invites two sorts of papers, discussion papers and system papers. So discussion papers are just thought pieces, and system papers describe systems that sort of work within or help cope with limits. And I know that my sometimes collaborator, Barath Raghavan, he's a bit dissatisfied because there are many thought pieces and people have a lot of thoughts, but we don't really build the systems. There are less systems being built that sort of like work within or help cope with limits this far. And I'll mention the prehistory, which also gives like why I'm interested in this. So I wrote a paper, not a real paper actually, just to a symposium in 2010. And this symposium was about ubiquitous information, well, IoT at the time, I guess, or something like that. And this was traumatic because when I presented it, someone in the audience that I actually knew, he became very, very angry and started to scream, not mostly at me, but actually at the organizers for allowing me to present this. And I used a picture from a book, and I didn't use that picture for 5 years afterwards because that was what made him very angry, this picture, the book cover, a book by Richard Heinberg called Peak Everything, Waking Up to a Century of Declines. Okay, but then I found Barath, who wrote a paper called Networking in the Long Emergency the year after, and I knew immediately that he had read a book called The Long Emergency. And he's a technical guy working in networking. And then we have a third paper, Collapse Informatics, and this is written, the first author, I changed on my computer. This is written by Bill Tomlinson and other people, and he's going to give the next talk, okay? So this made a big impression on me, and therefore I went to University of California, Irvine, where some of the authors then, or you know, were situated on a sabbatical 2 years later. I think I found out about this paper a year later, and I was blown away by the fact that you could get a paper like this published in a prestigious conference. This is the most prestigious conference in my area, the CHI conference. And Bill will come back to this in his talk and mention it. Okay, so yeah, and other papers happened. I wrote a paper together with Barath where we attacked computer scientists in our field who wrote about sustainability, and they were writing about small toy problems, and they didn't really know enough about sustainability, we said, and so on. Yeah, and this led to doing the first workshop on computing within limits. And for the most part, there's been one organized every year since. So computing within limits, it of course sort of also refers to limits to growth, the report from 72, which was an eye-opener for many people, or for the world also. And we did one in the beginning of the summer, another limits. This is the 8th. And I just want to say something about, so why do I think it's different, and why do I think it might fit some people here? Well, first of all, it looks at alternatives that are radical alternatives, or it's open for radical alternatives, at least you could say. You don't have to write such a paper, but you can. You can get papers published that you don't really have to collect data or do a study, which is nice for exploring ideas. And then I would say possibly, this community support is really interesting, because if you've gone through some sort of doubt, perhaps what follows is that you have no one to talk about and you become isolated because nobody around you understands what you're talking about when you talk about weird stuff like this, like limits in general. So this is, I would say, it's kind of a community that has served to support people who explore these thoughts. That's why I think that perhaps it's something for some of you. And here's an example of a thought piece, or like how you can turn things around. Perhaps many of you are familiar with this quote by William Gibson, who is a science fiction author and stated 30 years ago, he coined the term cyberspace in his novel Neuromancer from the beginning of the 90s. He has said repeatedly, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. So what we think of as the future already exists, perhaps, or parts of it in research labs, perhaps at this university or my university or Google or MIT or some other place. And later it will become disseminated and spread to rich people and then to middle-class people and globally, blah, blah, and then everybody will have a cell phone eventually. Which could be true. Here's sort of like the proximate future that is just around the corner. I don't know why this hasn't happened yet, because it seems to be the future is always almost here. And this guy who looks urban environment and has the Google glasses, I don't really know what happened with them, but we have other things instead that takes the place of Google glasses, which are almost here any day now, and they bring lots of promises. But from another perspective, perhaps from a limits perspective, you could turn around and say the collapse is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. Also, I mean, it's not that this is true instead of the first one. We have parallel development that goes in different directions, but we are exploring this here. And the collapse could be war in Europe and limits on wheat export, or climate chaos in Europe over the summer with heat waves and so on. And I'm going to give an example of my suggestion or how I have resolved this in my research, just like Tina talked about her doubt and where she ended up. And I will skip this because I realize I don't have time for that. Okay. So my problem is that, okay, we're going to design systems for a future of limits and scarcity, but like, what does that mean? What are we aiming for? Because people write thought pieces about using less, a bit less, but how much less, or what is the end goal? What would be sustainable? This is also why we do work on future studies to try to figure out scenarios of what could be a sustainable society. What does practical research look like if you're going to explore this? Well, you need to perhaps pluralize the future and think of not just one future, but more than one future. And I'm going to read the first 2-3 sentences from this Computing Within Limits article we wrote 5 years ago. So it says, computing researchers and practitioners are often seen as inventing the future. And as such, we are implicitly also in the business of predicting the future. We plot trajectories for the future in the problems we select, in the assumptions we make about technology and societal trends, and the ways we evaluate research. However, a great deal of computing research focuses on one particular type of future, one very much like the present, only more so. This vision of the future assumes that current trajectories of ever-increasing production and consumption will continue. Okay, so we need to figure out explore more alternatives, including futures of degrowth or post-growth, which I guess is the slightly more politically correct term. So that's what I'm doing, what we are doing in the project. If we take the Paris Agreement seriously to limit global warming at to 2 degrees or preferably closer to 1.5, then we have some researchers have then taken the baton and counted how much space is there in the atmosphere for additional carbon emissions. And others have taken that number and said, at what pace or rate do we need to decrease our carbon emissions to be in line with the carbon law? And the carbon law is, here is the carbon law. Basically what it states is that in order to not hit the Paris Agreement targets, we need to decrease carbon emissions by 50% every decade between 2020 and 2050. And even the last there remaining, we need to find ways to compensate, perhaps, plant more trees or whatever, or suck carbon out of the atmosphere, which, by the way, trees do for free, but anyway. Okay, so this is the trajectory. And I think that, to me, nowadays, this is what, if we're going to design system for a future of scarcity and limits, this is the thing the carbon law predicts and helps us. So any research project that helps decrease carbon emissions for real, not just like, oh, it could be used in this way, but rather actually can preferably put a number or try to hit targets, is good and worthy of doing. And I'll give you an example of a project then, which I'm working with together with, I added a third, I forgot, I don't have so much time, so I'm already ahead and going to talk about my project. But so my way of resolving this and trying to find out what I could do is embodied in a fourth principle, which is, well, we could develop something, IoT or AI, and we could imagine, perhaps fantasize how it could be used for sustainability purposes, but you can be sure that it can be used for anti-sustainability purposes also. And if track record and history gives guidance, it probably will be used not for sustainability, but higher chance that it will be used for profit, which probably lines up with against sustainability. So it's not really enough to develop something that could be used for sustainability. My take is that we should apply computing to right now solve real world problems. And so we should find them out ourselves or cooperate with people who are trying to solve real world problems and be of their service and help them reach their goals. For example, decreasing carbon emissions by 50% per decade, which is not like a traditional computing problem. Okay, so we had the carbon law. It says we should reduce carbon emissions in line with the carbon law, 50% per decade. This includes emissions from flying, and this includes emissions from my university's flying. I like the travel policy of this summer school, by the way. So we should actually decrease carbon emissions at my university by 50%. And we have a research project where it so happens that my university is our case study. Decrease CO2 emissions in flight-intensive organizations. It's not exclusive about my university or even universities, but rather organizations that fly a lot. But it just so happens that we look at data from our university. And we've done many visualizations of various kinds, like top-down that can work for management, and bottom-up, which is your personal trips. And then most promising actually is the middle-out perspective, where we go to the lowest collective level where individuals and organizations meet, which would be like a division, or perhaps it's called department in some places. And but what works even better is using poker chips, which is interesting. This is a department with 21 employees. Each post-it notice is an employee, and the yellow ones are PhD students and postdocs. And each poker chip is a one-way trip by plane in 2019, which was last year before COVID. And the green ones are within Scandinavia, the red ones are in Europe, and the black ones are intercontinental. And you can already now see that in terms of number of trips, some people travel a lot more than others, and actually 10 out of 21 persons didn't do a single trip by plane in 2019, but others did plenty. We have since updated it, and we use this department, and we printed this and made it a bit slicker. We can, by the way, yeah, this is the same department, but just from another angle. But here's the thing, in the end, we realized, or quickly we realized, that we're not really interested in number of trips. We're interested in carbon emissions. So you have to translate the green, red, and black poker chips. So one green, if that is the index, then a red for this department and this year, we crunched the data. So one red should be replaced by actually 3.4, but anyway, 3 poker chips. And an intercontinental trip on average has 20 times as much carbon emissions as a green sort of Scandinavia or Sweden trip. And then we replace a red for 3, actually not 3 green, but 3 red to show, well, here's the carbon emissions from this department. And what is interesting, it becomes quite clear who should fly less. I mean, it becomes abundantly clear, and it becomes very clear how we need to work, or how this department needs to work to hit their targets. Because again, 10 persons out of 21 didn't fly. And another, you know, of the flyers, perhaps half, you could say, did basically 1 or 2 trips or whatever. And then you have, this is a PhD student who did 1 intercontinental trip, and it towers above the neighbors. And here's someone who actually didn't do intercontinental trips, but a couple of trips within Europe. But actually, I actually have the number here. I'm going to check the slide. 74% of all emissions at this department comes from person number 1 and 2. So this is extremely illuminating, and we just show it to the department, and we don't tell them what they need to do. We just ask them what they think they should do to hit the targets. So we can avoid being activists. We just say, we have a policy and we have targets. This is your flying, it has to decrease. Sorry, this is your carbon emissions from flying. Do you have any suggestions? which is really, really interesting. And I only have a few more slides. I know that I should have stopped here, but this looks outlandish, but it's actually pretty much in line with the average situation at our university. So here we instead have the whole university. Here we have 100% of the researchers, which is 2,600. We also have administrators, but we're not so interested in there. They don't fly a lot. And here we have 100% of our carbon emissions from flying. And if everybody flew, every researcher, every PhD student and full professor flew exactly as much as everybody else, this would be, you know, 20% of the researchers would be responsible for 20% of the carbon emissions. But it actually looks exactly like the 80-20 rule. So the last 20% over here are responsible for 80% of total carbon emissions from all researchers. And 50%, again, just like that department, 50% of the people did not make a single trip by plane in 2019. So what you can see here is that the distribution of carbon emissions from flying is extremely skewed at our university. In fact, there's a measure, you can use the Gini coefficient to calculate how unevenly distributed the resource is. And the number is always between 1 and 0, and 1 means that like one person makes all the trips, and 0 means that everybody flies just as much, this line here. So the more skewed it is, the more unevenly distributed, and the Gini coefficient for KTH is 0.78. And this was amazing because it's actually higher than distribution of wealth in the world, more unevenly distributed. So flying, or carbon emissions from flying, is more unevenly distributed within my first world Swedish university than wealth is unevenly distributed in the world. That also says something about who should fly less. Just like Tina's, like the 5%, the top 5%. So I could talk about this forever. If you want to hear more, you just have to grab me in the break or whatever. But I'm gonna, so we, wrong computer. We handed in a new application because this project ends this year. So reduced emissions from business travel, joint efforts to achieve Swedish universities' climate goals. We have so ambitious climate goals, we just don't really do anything to reach them, which is not a problem for politicians or the president of a university who can just repeat the goals and will be out of presidency by the time they're supposed to, we would have reached them. But the climate officers, they want to reach these goals. So we reached out to chief sustainability officers at the universities, and we have 20 universities in Sweden who are part of the application, which is the majority of universities in Sweden. We still don't really know if we will do this project, but the reason why I mention it is because if we get it, and we will know soon, then we want to hire a data science or / statistics postdoc. So if anyone in the audience is sort of like finishing your PhD and you have a talent for this, you should also talk to me during the week, because we think that we have a high chance of getting this project, because if we are rejected, they would make 20 different universities sad. And that must also count for something. Okay, yeah, that's it. Questions?
Right on time.
4 minutes
thank you.
late.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Thanks a lot. So yeah, we have a bit more than 10 minutes for Q&A, so that you have a bit of time to grab a coffee and so afterwards. So feel free to raise your hand if you have anything to ask. Yeah. So one there. Any other question afterwards? Just to know a little bit. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. It's about the end of the presentation with your case of your university. It was in 2019. What now? Is it sufficient? Is it enough to just show them that, or is something changed or not?
Okay, so half the project was just trying to understand ourselves, how much we fly or who flies when and where and so on, and try to find ways to show that, to visualize. Again, we have lots of visualizations. Some of them are like more like artistic installations also, which are provocative and thought, so it's not like, but the one that works the best was the poker chips and post-it notes for some reason. And we're actually writing an HCI paper about physicalizing data and making it tangible and being able to, so we can squeeze some human-computer interaction stuff out of even the poker chips. Yeah, but the second part is actually doing the workshops and with the department. And to have them handle this challenge or / problem. I don't think that it will work unless top management are pushing for this or acknowledge that the goals actually, if we have these goals, we actually have to fly less. Surprise, surprise, because you don't want to tell professors that or whatever. So, and I have come to the conclusion that my university probably is only half-hearted trying to reach its climate targets. That's why we sent we've been looking for other universities and we reached out, and we hope that some of the 20 will be serious, where even the president is on and like, yeah, the president wants this to happen, but doesn't have the tools, and perhaps this could help. Because we don't have an authority to tell our colleagues that they should stop flying. We just have a research project where we find out stuff, and we can publish great papers perhaps, but then how do we get change to happen at our university? And my sad conclusion is that perhaps we don't, so perhaps we have to look for other universities. Yeah, but perhaps if some university, 1, 2, 3, 5 does this, that will put a lot of pressure on other universities. Oh, and one more thing, sorry. We have also pitched this to a funding agency that supports sustainability research and told them that they should require, we have suggested that they should require everyone who asks for research grants, if they get them, that they should also have a budget, or they should tell the funding agency how much they travel by air. And perhaps the funding agency can then calculate carbon emissions per million Swedish crowns in research projects and benchmark them, because that in itself would put a lot of pressure on us researchers, perhaps sidestepping the university and forcing us, like, if I want money from this agency that supports sustainability research, I have to have a realistic travel budget that does not include a lot of flight. And perhaps I should be ashamed compared to other, so that's another nice possible. Yeah, we try to use this project to go to the next level, but it takes so long time. This was a 3-year project, and now we're planning for the next, and If one funding agency would do that, that would put a lot of pressure on other funding agencies, etc. Perhaps on other countries also. Let's hope.
Question here. Actually, I have two questions, quick questions. The first one is, can you spoil quickly the paper about teaching and eco-anxiety? And the second question in a row is, while you were presenting the scope of limits, the workshop, it started like you were talking about mostly adaptation in the IPCC way of talking about things, and then you switch to mitigation, and there's some kind of tension between the two strategies. So I'd like you to comment on that, please.
No, I can't. I have double standards. I mean, there's what I think and believe, and then there's the research that I apply for money for, and then you have to do to pretend that we can solve this. Yeah, that was a very succinct. Is this recorded?
Yep.
Okay, that's not so good. No, but I guess that's, you know, it would be great if we can fix this, and nobody really knows. We don't know what the future has for us, but there's a high chance that we blew it, or that it will be very hard, or that we're not, you know, if we just shifted tomorrow, yeah, but we don't seem to, so therefore it's easy to not have so high hopes on a personal level, but you still have to find realistic research projects that you can apply for, and so on and so forth. So that's a balance that you have to try to handle as a researcher if you write project applications. But that's a very pragmatic and practical answer. The eco-anxiety, I think I'll skip that for now. We can talk later, or we're really excited about that, but I can't give a 1-minute answer. Yeah.
My turn? Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Interesting presentation. I'm interested in understanding how those two professors reacted to your assessment. Did they try and wiggle out and say, hey, we are the big stars, so that's our travel budget? Or how did they react? And my other question is, how do travel emissions relate to overall climate impacts of a department? Like, is that really the big thing? Or is building management, equipment purchases, and so on maybe bigger and more within our scope as computing people to work on?
Okay, yeah, I would say at our university, you could say that travel or air travel, because air travel, flying is the only thing that matters in terms of carbon emissions. All other travel is insignificant. But air travel is a third of our carbon emissions, and buildings are a third, and then everything else is a third. But I've seen figures from other universities that differ significantly. So there's no standard for calculating this. And I'm myself confused when I compare universities, like how can they only travel? How can air travel be only 10% there? I just don't get it. Perhaps they don't have a designated travel agency where we have to book our tickets from the university mandated travel agency. So we have one-stop shop for data. Perhaps other people, I know that in other universities, you can book your own trip. And then, like, how do the university even know where you travel, for example? So that's about data quality. And then, yeah, how did you react? Yeah, the top flyer was at the workshop, not the number one person who had made a lot of trips, but many within Sweden. Well, first of all, they're trying to figure out who is who. And he said, it was a he said, that's probably me. But what I was surprised about was how leniently the others treated him, this person who flew a lot. It's like everybody has really, even the people who don't fly, perhaps for personal or moral reasons, seem to excuse someone who's a full professor and who flies a lot, which I would have thought that they become angry or like, you have to fly less or whatever, but everybody's very understanding. But I have also become more understanding, because it's like nobody has ever confronted anyone with their carbon emissions from flying before. So it's hard to say that he should have traveled less. He has never had to take responsibility for that. No one has. So I'm thinking now of carbon emissions as some sort of currency that or a resource that we have to husband. So we probably will continue to fly. We won't stop cold turkey tomorrow, but we should do unnecessary trips should be reduced. And everybody agrees that unnecessary, but then like, what's an unnecessary trip? But the bar for what is an unnecessary trip needs to be raised every year so that we lower number of trips and carbon emissions. And perhaps we should think of travel and carbon emissions from travel as an investment or like budget for a department where you really have to care about it. You can't blow through the budget and say, give me more money. But then someone needs to put down the foot and say, like, you've traveled, your department, you're out of carbon emissions. You have to stay home for 3 months now. You get more next year. You know, you have to have someone who takes that decision, and they don't have the guts or the spine, or perhaps no one has, or it's rare for a university to actually say that. And perhaps people would quit. We don't know. There are so many questions, and academic practices. Perhaps some people feel pressure to fly to have a nice CV and to present at this conference in the US or whatever. So it's enmeshed in many different practices. It's not just the carbon emissions and the poker chips. It's like what it means to be a researcher nowadays. Yeah. Anyway, so that opens up to new things. But
thanks a lot. We have one question here, one over there, and okay, we have a bit less than 5 minutes, so try to keep the question short so that you have the thing. So one question here.
Thank you. So my question then, thank you so much for your talk, is related to what you just said, and it might be very philosophical and you don't have to answer, but it made me wonder, is there sustainability without fairness? Do you think it, because your project with the poker chips or the post-it, it really shows that there is an issue of fairness here, who should reduce where and what, and is there a sustainability agenda that is productive and possible without considering these questions of fairness?
Yeah, what I think is that this picture I showed of our university, it's like the world in a microcosm. It's like the inequality of the world within the university, which we wouldn't ever have thought. And we actually had a new thought just this spring. We were asking ourselves, like, are we okay with the same amount of emissions, but they are more equally distributed so that the people who fly nothing or little can perhaps get some more and others should hold back? Or would we want to decrease carbon emissions at our university, even if they continue to be as unequally distributed as they currently are? And we said, well, we want the latter because we want to decrease carbon emissions. We don't primarily care about the distribution and fairness and justice here in our case study. We just want carbon emissions to decrease so we hit our targets. However, as I showed, it will be hard to decrease them without limiting the top polluters. Exactly. See, not top flyers, top polluters the most. I mean, like, it's quite clear that you can't hold back if you only did one trip, then the person who did 10 or 15 should. So they go together in the end.
They do, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess it's even more true when you see how fast you have to decrease. It's not like 1 or 2, it's like, yeah, half and half. So one there, you have the mic? Okay.
Yeah. I actually want to make a comment, but then your question about justice also raised this point about if you say you want to decrease, that's more an observation, the total carbon emissions. And in the end, it's also the people who are building a career who will not be able to fly maybe, unless we radically shift sort of, because in the end, that bottom percent will also shift towards the 100% slowly. Because it's also part of an academic career that you build networks and you do sort of things, so you move there. But my comment that what I want to make was that actually the Free University of Amsterdam, they have created a policy now that you're only allowed to fly once a year, everybody.
Wow.
So you can take the train, but you can only fly once a year. Of course, there's some loopholes around it. And I don't work there, but I have friends who work there. But it's interesting because it changes the mindset of people. It's like you either go to places that you take by train or you really only fly when you feel like you have to.
That sounds amazing. I haven't heard about that. I have to say about the career thing. Yeah, obviously we have to change. Like if we are serious about decreasing carbon emissions, blah, blah, we should think about hiring criteria also at the university. We can't benefit people who have flown a lot and, you know, like people who for various reasons stay at home, perhaps because they don't have money, because their conscience tells them not to fly, shouldn't be disadvantaged compared to others when they apply for a job, for example. So that's a big change, which goes far beyond our project and flying, for example. However, so we're writing a paper, haven't had time to write much about it, where this colleague or friend of mine, he had 2 great concepts. So we have to shift from Holocene higher education from Holocene higher education to Anthropocene academia. She used Holocene and Anthropocene. So, and we have to explore what that means, but it definitely includes less flying. So it's just a matter of fact. If we're going to hit the climate targets and the Paris Agreement, we will have to fly less, and that's it. So first you have to accept that, and then we can discuss how to make the change and who should fly less and at what pace and so on.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, and we could still keep it for hours. I just want to, like, there is a last question to pick up on the, like, what will it imply for academic careers and that stuff. We will discuss that on Wednesday with the panel on degrowing science and research. What are like issues and kind of stuff, and there is a table about that, like fundings and traveling and careers. So we will be able to discuss that on Wednesday. So maybe a last question, and then we'll go for the coffee break, and then we'll have Bill Tomlinson in 30 minutes. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. It's more about a point of the middle of the talk. You said that research direction should go towards sustainability, and that it's sometimes hard to have a research direction and know if it's going to be used for or against sustainability. But I feel like that even when we target sustainability, it's hard to know if there are no loopholes or that detour that can make our research bad in the end. And for evaluation, I feel like it's sometimes easy to know that our assessment will be for sustainability because it's an evaluation. But for practical development, do you think there are guidelines to follow to go for sustainability and be sure of our objective that will be met and not a detour of our ICT development?
She's written a paper about that. But I would say that I also sort of have to excuse myself here, because it's also easy for me, because I stand here and I hold the microphone to say, like, you should do this and blah, blah. But it might not be very easy for many people to do what I just suggested. Like, how do you solve real sustainability problems, or how do you cooperate with people who solve real, or make yourself available and help them? Here I'm thinking of a guy, software engineer, researcher, Steve Easterbrook, who said, like, already in the 90s, I think he said, like, okay, what I do about better system development processes is like, why the I don't, you know, what does this do for humanity? So he said, I'm going to help climate scientists to make better software when they develop their models. And then he dedicated himself to that, which probably was a very brave thing, perhaps. I don't know what, it doesn't seem to have affected his career, but anyway. But if you're a PhD student, it might be, of course, a lot harder to take charge of your research and do, you know, so I mean, there are lots of limitations. You've been accepted at a certain department, perhaps in a certain project, and you're required, or, you know, so there will be many limitations. Perhaps this then doesn't apply to you when I said, like, 4 principles anyway. Apply computing to solve real world sustain. I guess that the first priority should be to finish your thesis and to manage that, you know, whatever that takes. But then you should also go to a summer school like this, even if it's not 100% relevant to your research, and you can shift or change afterwards, but you have to know what you want to do, so you can take that into account, and you can go to limits or whatever. Yeah, okay, that didn't really answer. It was more like I did a politician answer and pretended to answer while saying something else. That yeah, anyway, but I guess we'll leave it at that because we need a coffee break soon.
Yeah, actually, I don't know if we need it, but we will take one. So we will end it here. Thanks a lot, Daniel, for this outstanding talk.